everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I want to address 5 misconceptions that I have seen traditionally published authors such as myself have about self-publishing. I know what you're thinking. Why are you talking about this? You're not even self-published. I know, exactly. But I consider myself someone who's pretty aware of the realities of self-publishing, the pros and cons of self-publishing, and what it takes to hack it in self-publishing. I respect those who do it well, and I am aware of my own limitations when it comes to self-publishing at this juncture. But what I have seen a lot of lately, and I think part of this is a lot of the crunch that's happening in traditional publishing, and it's harder and harder to make money and be successful, blah, 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 blah. I've seen some of my peers on the traditional publishing side make some blunders. They've thrown out some ideas about how easy it is to self-publish, and I just jotted down a quick list and was like, I want to disavow people of some of these notions. But this comes with recommendations because I want to throw, after I cover these misconceptions, to people who really know what they're talking about. I think the key thing for fellow traditionally published authors is to listen to the people who know what they're doing, who are experts in this area. Some people that I like to watch who I have learned a lot from when it comes to self-publishing are Jenna Marecki and Lyra Parrish, and I will link down below to them because I think they're great cases of, look, when you do things right, it's a ton of work, and you can do things right. I've said it before and I'll say it again. For me personally, I will not self-publish until it's something that I can do the right way, because there is a right way and a wrong way to self-publish, and really there's a right way and a wrong way to traditionally publish as well, but that's a whole other topic. But I want to talk about these blunders I've seen some of my peers make, as well as a few that I've made, misconceptions I have had in the past. So the first one is that you can totally skimp on your cover design. You can do any cheap cover you want. It's not, you don't have to bother spending money, investing money in a decent cover. And this really bugs me because I think it's really disrespectful to current indie publishing. Authors I find who have this idea are still stuck in 2012 or earlier, where, yeah, covers used to be a lot more amateurish, or it didn't matter as much if your covers were professional, but that just isn't the case anymore in self-publishing. There is a line between, amateur hour and professional self-publishing, and all of the professionals know how valuable a good cover is. And if you invest in a good cover designer and spend proper amounts of money, that it pays dividends. And they also know that it's not just about the cover, and this is why it's more expensive to pay properly for good design services for your self-published book. It's not just the cover, it's the cover, it's the back cover, it's the insides, it's inside page design, it's text setting. There's all of this stuff that goes into designing and formatting a traditionally published book, and it makes sense that you put all of the same work into your self-published book. I know that you don't need the full cover wrap, etc. if you're only doing digital publishing, but especially if you do want to do paperback or hardcover, you need to spring for the full book design. It makes a huge difference. And so it just really bugs me. I've seen a few authors do this, go like, I'm thinking of trying self-publishing. What are some cheap design options? And it's like, you shouldn't use cheap design options because this is one of the key areas where it is worth investing good money. Speaking of that, another good place to invest your money is in strong editorial services, but that isn't a specific misconception I'm going to be covering because most traditional authors do know how important it is to have a good editor, so they would never question hiring a good editor. But if you are less familiar with self-publishing, you should know hiring a good editor is another essential investment when you are self-publishing. And this does lead to the misconception I've seen among some traditionally published authors, and that is that you can just throw a book out there and see how it does. And I get this, it's really tempting. In fact, I've seen non-traditionally published authors do this too. It's always Reddit. The idea that they want to see how their book does, so they'll self-publish it. And this just gives really short shrift to the seriousness of the decision to self-publish. Self-publishing should be a professional publishing decision you make. And saying like, oh, I'll just throw it up there and see how it does really undermines the seriousness of publishing. Once you have an ISBN, which is a step you take when you self-publish, your publisher does it for you when you're traditionally publishing, It is a published book. Your book has been published. The first rights of publication are gone. And this is something that many self-published authors don't understand. They just throw it out there to see how it does. It's like, well, once you do that, a traditional publisher isn't going to want it. Because once it's out there and it's for sale, if it fails, it's a failure. And that's what a lot of traditionally published authors don't understand. I understand the impulse to be like, on a lark, ooh, let me try self-publishing. But I think if you don't approach it with strategy and seriousness, that you're only failing yourself because you need to take it seriously, which leads me to the third misconception, which is going to bring me to marketing. And that's the misconception that many traditionally published authors have that, well, I'm a decent writer, I'm a good writer, I write pretty good books, they'll sell well because I'm a good writer. No. And this actually comes up in traditional publishing as well. I think we all know it. We're all a little jaded about publishing, and that is marketing does a lot for a book. You can have 2 books in any publishing avenue, and one could have technically better writing and the other maybe isn't as well written. But if this one has really juicy story and a swank-ass marketing campaign, it can sell better and do better than good little book over here that just maybe didn't have as commercial a pitch and didn't get any marketing. So the same thing is true in indie publishing. Just because you're a good writer, so to speak, or you think you're better than the people who are publishing in the same genre space doesn't mean butt kiss. You need to know the genre space, know the market, respect the market, because indie publishing markets are different from traditional publishing markets. You need to know what does well in that space, and you need to know and respect that it's more than just, I'm a pretty good writer. It's, I got a good cover. I was smart about marketing. I understood how to reach these readers. I didn't disrespect the title leaders in the category because I think I'm better than they are. Don't underestimate people having diehard faves who have a massive catalog of books and you don't. You don't get to just march into self-publishing being like, I'm a good writer, here's a book. That isn't going to automatically make you successful. You have to actually understand how indie publishing works specific to whatever you are writing. You need to do the research, do the due diligence, and then be smart about your writing strategy and your marketing strategy. Which brings me to number 4, which is a lot of traditionally published authors think, well, I can just write books the way that I write books for traditional publishing, and it's cool. And you can be successful in self-publishing, writing less frequently, publishing less frequently. I think Jenna Moretti is a really fantastic example. But she's developed people who are fans of her who will wait for her next book. And I also think in fantasy and sci-fi, there doesn't have to be as much frequency. But let's talk about indie romance. You do need to be publishing more often in that space. And again, this is knowing the market. Readers of indie romance are voracious readers. And if they like one book by you, they want to read another one. You need to make sure they have another one to read and that they're never waiting too long for your titles. So you can't do what you do in traditional publishing and spend 6 months to a year on a book and only publish them once a year. And that is honestly why I respect super successful indie publishers so much. They are hustling on their writing in a way that I am not currently capable of. And I have been trying to train myself to write faster because I am interested in self-publishing, specifically in categories and genres that don't do as well in traditional publishing. But I know that at this juncture, I can't hack it. And I think that it's just good for traditionally published authors to understand that there are differences between the two markets and you don't just get to barge in and throw your weight around because you think you're fancy. So the 5th misconception that I've had, that many of my peers have, partly because things are changing, that I think is worth talking about, is that if you indie publish, if you self-publish, you can't be in bookstores and libraries. This used to be uniformly true, but has definitely started changing in the last couple of years, and so I've learned a lot. I've been taken to school, here on YouTube specifically, and it's really interesting to me. Now, traditional publishing remains the best means of physical book distribution for most titles, and for specific genres as well. However, it doesn't mean you can't get bookstore distribution and library distribution as an indie published author. It's never going to be quite the same as traditional publication because of the decades, in some cases centuries, of relationships and kind of agreements that are in place. There's a reason traditional publishing is really great at book distribution. They've been doing it for a very long time, but there are now tools in place for indie published authors to get some bookstore and library distribution. And I think the most important thing is to know which categories can get bookstore and library distribution, and then the limitations of that bookstore and library distribution. And the third one being, and if you want bookstore and library distribution, you got to do that work. You know what can get bookstore and library distribution? A beautifully designed book that is printed, especially in hardcover. It doesn't have to be hardcover, but the hardcovers look really good. That people want to read. And so if you have people who request your book at the library, they might order it. Now, the caveat here that is important to cover, again, this is almost like a two-way misconception. I think that traditionally published authors such as myself need to understand that things have changed a little bit, but also self-published authors need to understand that it is kind of apples and oranges. Like, you're still in the orchard together, but it is a little bit different. The apples can become pie and the oranges become juice. Specific to library distribution, currently the best way for an indie title to be eligible for library distribution, and actually bookstore distribution as well, it's all about Ingram. So there are services that you can pay for with Ingram, and this is what opens you up to the world of book distribution, and this is a good thing. However, it's important to understand, we're going to start with libraries, how library ordering works, like how librarians are actually able to purchase titles. I could do a whole video on this, and I probably should. So I'm basically friends with a bunch of librarians, so I've actually picked their brains about this because I was super curious. And there are two primary competitor book purchasing catalogs. There's Baker and Taylor and there's Ingram. And the important thing to know as an indie author is that most libraries use Baker and Taylor's system, and indie published books aren't in the Baker and Taylor system. So many libraries cannot order a self-published book through Baker and Taylor, and very often they're only allowed to use Baker and Taylor. It has to do with budgets and rules and all that kind of stuff. So in some cases, if they use Baker and Taylor, it's just not going to happen. But there are libraries who use Ingram, and so it is still very worthwhile trying to request titles at your local library, trying to get carriage, because if the library has Ingram, they can buy your title. Or there are workarounds that certain librarians can do, so this is going to depend on the library and the librarian. So if an indie title is really popular, they can do workarounds for ordering indie titles, but it's important that it's either you're a local author, so like they know who you are and they want to support you, or you do get a lot of requests from readers at that library. So that's kind of the caveat workaround. Just for comparison, a traditionally published distributed book that is in Baker and Taylor is just, it's easier to order. They have the wholesale discounts that publishers offer, and so you're just going to have more volume of distribution when you're traditionally published. So that's just important to know. And then bookstores. The good thing is that Ingram is one of the industry standards for bookstore distribution, so being part of the Ingram system does give you access to a lot of bookstores. What I've noticed personally is that unless you have a local connection to the bookstore, and by the way, if you're local, make connections with your bookstores, because this is one of the great exceptions of indies being in bookstores, they can order you through the Ingram catalog, and so you can be stocked in that store. Most often I've seen that indie titles are more likely to be stocked online, so they're purchasable through the bookstore, but they might not necessarily like be on a display in the bookstore. And part of the reason for this, just this is good to know, publishers really do have very ingrained relationships with bookstores, and they pay for certain books to be featured. In Barnes & Noble, for example, publishers pay for a book to be on like the promo table, and they pay for it to be on the end caps. So there's this whole system. I'm less certain about indies being paid, but I do know there are incentive programs with indie bookstores to order titles from certain publishers. I mean, not just indie bookstores, all bookstores, where like if you order 5 HarperCollins titles, you get a 6th title for free, and this incentivizes bookstores to order more books from certain publishers. And they also, of course, have free returns when they're from a major publisher, which isn't the case with smaller publishers and indie. So that's actually nitty-gritty of how bookstore distribution works, but that's why more often the indie titles are more likely to be available online. They're not going to be on the shelf space necessarily unless you have a direct arrangement with the bookseller. another exception. As Amazon is creating more physical bookstores, they have indie titles in those stores. And so I do think in the next 5 years, we're probably going to see more shifts, but distribution remains the primary pro point of traditional publishing for most categories and genres, but it is not black and white anymore. It's not all or nothing the way that it used to be. And that has been something really instructive for me to learn, also really useful for my future publishing plans. Important for the traditionally published side to understand, but also for indie published authors to kind of understand the kind of nuances and differences within the system. So that's it. Those are just kind of the things that I have noticed my peers basically aren't up on the times with. And I get it if you're not actually paying attention, and I've paid more and more attention as I've been on YouTube. You don't know. And I think it's worth kind of learning and understanding, because as publishing evolves, as everything evolves, the smartest thing an author can do, and I firmly believe this, is to diversify their options. I think hybrid authorism is the way to go in the future. It's been my long-term plan for a long time. I long-term planned like 5 to 10 years pursuing traditional publishing, and then long game. It definitely involves self-publishing. That's always been my plan. But as self-publishing evolves, you have to stay up with the times and keep on top of things. So that's my little thing. All right, as I mentioned, I have learned so much from fellow authors who publish videos on YouTube. I already mentioned Jenna Moretti and Lyra Parrish. Really recommend those. Lyra's channel is new, but I've already learned so much. She posted 2 videos on Kindle Unlimited, and it was like, poof. There's so many nuances to indie publishing that people just don't understand until someone tells them all about it. So there are also tons of other channels on YouTube. I'll link to any down below that I could think of that have like taught me something. And I highly recommend, like, no matter what your path is, just kind of learning as much as you can and making, you know, smart, good choices. And to my fellow traditionally published authors, like, just don't assume that you can slap a cover on something, throw it on the internet, and be a bestseller, because that's just not how it works. So let me know down below in the comments, what are some things that you've learned about self-publishing or traditional publishing that kind of defied your expectations? Give this video a thumbs up if you like it, and I will make more like it. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, guys, happy writing.